Carolina, 1859. The grand plantation stood proud beneath the southern sun, its white columns gleaming like a symbol of wealth and order. But behind those walls lived a woman with a secret so dark it would never appear in history books. This is the story of a mother who turned her own sons into masters of cruelty. Stay with us, like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover one of the South's most chilling untold stories. By the year 1859, the American South stood at a crossroads. On the surface, life appeared calm, with sprawling estates, fields heavy with cotton, and the steady rhythm of enslaved hands working from dawn until dusk. Yet beneath this image of wealth and order lay a system of brutality, fear, and secrets so deep they were rarely spoken aloud. In the Carolinas, plantations stretched for miles, their boundaries marked by wooden fences and moss-draped oaks that lined the dirt roads. The great houses were built to impress, white-pillared mansions that declared the power and refinement of the families who lived inside. To neighbors and visitors, these homes represented the very heart of Southern gentility. Yet for the enslaved, they were cages, reminders of chains that could never be broken. The economy of the South in 1859 was built almost entirely on the backs of enslaved labor. Cotton was king, rice and tobacco followed, and nearly every wealthy family measured its fortune, not just in acres, but in the number of enslaved people it owned. Men gathered in counting rooms to talk of trade and politics, while women of the plantation elite were expected to play the part of refined mistresses, hosting dinners, attending church, and maintaining the image of a moral and upright household. But appearances were deceiving. Behind the lace curtains and Sunday smiles, cruelty often reigned. Whippings, auctions, and forced separations were part of daily life for enslaved people. And by the late 1850s, another practice had quietly taken root in certain corners of the South, a chilling method of increasing the stock without spending money at the slave markets. Some planters saw no shame in forcing enslaved women to bear children, treating their bodies as breeding vessels. It was a cruelty that robbed women of choice, of dignity, and of family. And it created tangled bloodlines that history books rarely acknowledged. In towns across the Carolinas, whispers grew louder as the country itself edged toward war. John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry had taken place just weeks earlier in October 1859, sending shockwaves through the South. Slaveholders feared uprisings, feared betrayal within their own walls, and feared that the system they built their fortunes on was beginning to crumble. Tension hung heavy in the air, a tension so thick it seemed even the enslaved could feel the storm brewing. Within this world lived the lady of the plantation, at the heart of our story. Her estate was known for its order, its wealth, and its strict discipline. To visitors, she embodied the Southern ideal of grace and propriety. She was a widow, respected in her church, and often praised for her sharp mind. But power had hardened her heart. In her eyes, enslaved men and women were not people. They were possessions, bodies that could be punished, worked, or used as she pleased. And she was not alone. Many in her circle of neighbors shared similar views, though not all dared to act as boldly as she did. The South of 1859 was a society in conflict with itself, outwardly proud, but secretly corrupt, fiercely protective of family honor, yet quietly tolerating the most dishonorable acts inside plantation walls. For the enslaved, 1859 was a year of dread. Rumors of war brought both fear and hope. Some prayed for freedom, others feared harsher punishment if rebellion came. Families clung to one another at night, not knowing if tomorrow would bring an auction, a whipping, or the loss of a child. They lived in silence, under constant watch, carrying burdens no human should have to bear. It was in this setting, a world on the brink of war, a land where wealth was built on human suffering, that one plantation family's darkest secret took shape. A secret that would twist bloodlines, destroy lives, and leave scars that would outlast the war itself. The story of this Carolina plantation lady is not just about one family. It is about an entire society built on lies. Lies told to the world, lies told in church pews, and lies whispered in the dead of night. And as we step deeper into her story, we see how power, cruelty, and silence came together in a way that would forever haunt the soil of the South. Her name was whispered in town with a mixture of admiration and unease. Some called her Margaret of Greenfield, though others preferred simply the Lady. In the polite circles of the Carolina Low Country, she was praised as a model of Southern womanhood, elegant, well-read, and fiercely protective of her family's estate. Yet those who lived under her roof knew her differently. To them, she was not a lady at all. She was a ruler. Margaret had not always stood at the head of the plantation. Years earlier, she had been the wife of a stern but respected planter, a man who demanded obedience from both his family and the enslaved. His sudden death, brought on by fever, left her a widow before her sons were fully grown. In many households, a woman alone would have struggled. But Margaret was not ordinary. She stepped into power as if she had been waiting for it all along. She ran her estate with sharp precision. Accounts were kept in perfect order, crops were harvested on time, and her fields, though demanding, were more productive than many run by men. The community admired her resolve, calling her strong and capable. In truth, it was not strength that guided her, but control. She believed the plantation was hers alone to shape, and everyone, from the enslaved in the fields to her own children in the house, was expected to obey her will. The enslaved workers learned quickly that her gentility ended where obedience faltered. A spilled pail, a slowed pace, even the sound of a child's cry could ignite her fury. Punishment was swift and cruel. Some said she carried a thin cane, which she used not only on the enslaved, but also on her servants inside the house. Others recalled how she would order overseers to whip men until their backs ran red, and then demand those same men return to the fields by dawn the next day. She believed pain kept people in line. And to her, order was everything. Yet Margaret's cruelty was not only physical. It was psychological. She played favorites, pitting enslaved people against each other, offering scraps of privilege to one while condemning another. She understood that fear was powerful, but division was stronger. By keeping those beneath her at odds, she secured her position as the unchallenged mistress of Greenfield. To her sons, however, Margaret wore a different face. She was affectionate in public, presenting herself as the devoted mother, determined to raise men worthy of the Greenfield name. She spoke of honor, of duty, of their responsibility to uphold the family legacy. Yet her lessons carried a darker edge. Where others might teach sons kindness or respect, Margaret taught power and possession. She whispered to them that the world was theirs to command, that people, especially the enslaved, were tools placed in their hands by God himself. Neighbors occasionally wondered about her methods. Some whispered that Margaret was too strict, that she denied her boys the gentleness of youth. But others admired her discipline, convinced that her estate would survive because she had raised heirs who feared nothing. What no outsider could see was how far Margaret was willing to go. She had learned, through years of managing Greenfield, that enslaved women were more than laborers. They were the key to growing wealth without expense. Each child born into bondage meant another body for the fields, another asset to be tallied in the ledgers. Some planters paid dearly at auctions to gain this advantage. Margaret chose another path. She began encouraging her sons to take what they wanted. She told them that enslaved women existed not only to work, but to serve the desires of their masters. At first, it may have been subtle, a suggestion, a quiet allowance, A blind eye turned when rumors spread. But soon it became an expectation. Her sons were young, impressionable, and eager to prove themselves. With their mother's approval, they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Margaret's public life remained untarnished. She sat in the front pew of church, greeted neighbors with a soft smile, and hosted suppers where laughter filled the dining hall. But behind the closed shutters of Greenfield, an unholy cycle had begun. A cycle of possession, of cruelty, and of silence. The enslaved women bore the weight of it. They could not speak, for who would listen? They could not resist, for punishment was worse than submission. And with every passing season, the line between the master's family and the enslaved blurred in ways no one dared acknowledge. Margaret ensured it remained hidden. To the world, she was a widow protecting her sons and her fortune. But to those who suffered under her rule, she was something else entirely, the architect of their torment. And as 1859 drew closer to its end, the seeds she had planted within her own household began to bear fruit, fruit that would darken her family's name forever. They were still boys when their father died, too young to inherit his authority, too old to be sheltered from the world that awaited them. Thomas and Edward grew up under the shadow of Greenfield's great oaks and the greater shadow of their mother's will. The plantation was their playground, their classroom, and their kingdom in waiting. But the lessons they learned, they were not the ones most sons receive. From the beginning, Margaret made sure they understood who they were. They were not just sons. They were heirs, the future masters of a legacy that stretched back generations. She told them that Greenfield's soil carried their blood, that its wealth and order depended on them. And she taught them, slowly, deliberately, that people could be owned just as easily as land at first. The boys followed the rhythms of plantation life like any young heirs would. They watched the overseers in the fields, followed their mother on her inspection rounds, and studied the ledgers she kept locked in her desk. They learned how to calculate the yield of cotton, how to judge the strength of a man by the width of his shoulders, how to measure a woman's value by the children she might bear. They grew fluent in the language of ownership before they ever understood the meaning of mercy dot as teenagers. They were given small responsibilities, a team of enslaved workers to supervise, a wagon to oversee during harvest, or a task to manage while their mother watched. Each success was rewarded with praise, each failure met with cold silence. Margaret did not tolerate softness. When Thomas once expressed pity for an old man whipped for slowing his pace, she rebuked him harshly. Pity is for those who have nothing to protect. You will rule here one day, and rulers do not pity. By their late teens, the transformation was complete. The innocence of childhood had been replaced by a hardened belief in their own supremacy. They spoke with the tone of men who had never been denied anything. They walked among the enslaved with the swagger of kings. And their mother, proud and satisfied, stepped back just enough to let them take control. It began with small abuses, insults shouted across the fields, orders given simply to watch them obeyed, punishments handed out to prove authority. But power, once tasted, demands more. Soon, the sons wanted more than obedience. They wanted domination. And Margaret, who could have stopped it, instead encouraged it. She told them that control must be absolute, that to rule was not only to command labor, but to claim bodies, to take without question. The line between discipline and cruelty blurred. Thomas, the elder, was known for his temper. A spilled bucket, a dropped tool, even a glance he deemed disrespectful, could earn an enslaved man a whipping so savage it left scars for life. Edward, quieter but colder, preferred humiliation. He devised punishments meant not just to hurt, but to break the spirit, locking people in smokehouses for days, denying food, forcing public displays of obedience. But their worst cruelty was reserved for the women, The first assault was whispered about in secret. A young girl taken from the laundry house late one night returned before dawn with silent eyes and trembling hands. Others followed. The brothers treated the enslaved women as their right, their inheritance, their proof of manhood. They boasted to each other about their conquests, laughing as if their violence were a game. Children born from those nights were left without names, their mothers forced to raise them in shame, their fathers never acknowledging them. And Margaret knew. She always knew. Sometimes she heard the cries echoing down the hallway. Sometimes she saw the faces of women who dared not meet her gaze. But she did nothing. In her mind, her sons were only fulfilling their role, expanding the plantation's stock, strengthening the family's control. What others might call evil, she saw as destiny. Not everyone turned a blind eye. Among the enslaved, the brothers' cruelty became a story whispered in work songs and hushed conversations. They called Thomas the Storm and Edward the Frost. One burned hot and violent. The other froze hearts with his coldness. Mothers warned their daughters to stay away from the house after dark. Husbands and fathers watched helplessly, knowing resistance could mean death. The brothers grew bolder with age. They no longer waited for their mother's approval. They took what they wanted, when they wanted, and bragged about it openly. Even some of the overseers, hardened men themselves, found the brothers' actions disturbing. But Greenfield was a place where silence was survival, and silence reigned by the eve of 1859. Thomas was 22 and Edward 20. They were no longer boys. They were masters, not just of the land, but of the lives trapped within it. And the plantation was no longer just a place of labor. It was a theater of cruelty, shaped by a mother's twisted lessons and carried out by sons who believed they were gods. But power, once abused, always leaves a trace. The brothers' actions were not forgotten. They lingered in the memories of those who suffered, in the stories passed down through generations, and in the bloodlines that would one day blur the very notion of master and slave. The Lady of Greenfield had raised her sons to rule. Instead, she had created monsters. For the enslaved women of Greenfield, silence was not just a choice. It was survival. They rose before dawn, their bare feet moving across the dirt floors of their cabins, their bodies already weary from endless labor. They cooked meals not for themselves, but for the family that claimed to own them. They washed linens, hauled water, and bent over in the cotton fields until their backs ached and their hands bled. And yet, for many, the hardest burden was not the work of the day. It was the fear of the night at dusk, when the shadows grew long across the fields. Whispers passed quietly among them. Stay away from the big house. Mothers clutched their daughters closer, their eyes darting toward the mansion where Thomas and Edward prowled. Husbands and fathers could offer no protection. Any attempt at resistance would bring the lash or worse. They carried their helplessness like a stone in their chest, forced to watch as their wives, sisters, and daughters were taken without mercy. For the women, every creak of the floorboards, every knock at the cabin door after dark carried terror. When the brothers summoned them, refusal was impossible. To say no meant punishment, stripped bare before the quarters, whipped until flesh tore. To say yes was not consent, but an act of survival. And so they walked in silence, into the big house, their steps heavy, their hearts breaking, their dignity stolen piece by piece. When they returned before dawn, they often said nothing. They simply resumed their work, cooking, cleaning, nursing the white children of the household, as if nothing had happened. To speak of it would bring no justice. To cry openly would invite more cruelty. Silence became their shield, their only fragile defense in a world where their voices held no weight. Some bore children from these nights, babies born into bondage, carrying blood that tied them both to their mothers and to their masters. It was a cruel paradox. Their faces sometimes bore a resemblance to the very men who had forced themselves upon their mothers. But those men would never call them sons, never call them brothers, never call them family. Instead, the children were listed in the plantation's records, valued only as property, another body to labor in the fields when grown. Imagine the pain of a mother, cradling her child, knowing his father was also his master. Imagine the shame forced upon her, not by her own actions, but by the violence done to her. These women carried that pain in silence, their tears shed in the privacy of the night, their voices lowered to whispers no overseer could hear. Yet silence did not mean acceptance. In their own quiet ways, they resisted. Some hid their daughters in corners of the quarters when the brothers came searching. Some feigned illness, hoping to be spared for one night. Others carved prayers into the wood of their cabin walls, asking God for strength to endure. A few sang songs in the fields, songs that on the surface seemed like hymns. But beneath the words carried messages of pain, survival, and secret defiance. The community of the enslaved held each other up as best they could. An older woman might take in a young girl, shielding her as if she were her own child. Men would whisper words of comfort to their wives, even as their hearts boiled with rage. They could not stop the cruelty, but they could offer love in the only ways available to them, small gestures, fleeting moments of tenderness in a world that tried to strip them of everything human. Even the children sensed what was happening. They noticed the fear in their mother's eyes. They saw how some of their playmates bore lighter skin, how whispers followed them wherever they went. They grew up under the weight of secrets they could not fully understand, secrets that shaped their identity before they had a chance to choose who they wanted to be. The silence stretched beyond Greenfield. Other plantations, other enslaved communities, carried similar scars. Some whispered of women taken by their masters, of children born in shame, of secrets buried to protect families' reputations. The practice was not rare. What made Greenfield different was how openly it was fostered, how a mother encouraged her sons to commit the very acts others tried to hide. And so, the enslaved women of Greenfield lived in a state of quiet despair. By day, they bent their backs to labor. By night, they endured a cruelty few could imagine. Their voices, silenced by fear, carried only in the wind, in the soft cries muffled against cabin walls, in the lullabies sung to children who bore the blood of both oppressor and oppressed. History often forgets these women. Their names were rarely written down, their stories rarely recorded. But their silence was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of endurance. They survived the unthinkable, carrying pain that could not be spoken, and in their survival, they preserved a truth the world tried to erase. For behind the grandeur of the plantation, behind the wealth and the polished manners of the mistress and her sons, the real story of Greenfield was written not in ledgers or sermons, but in the suffering of women whose voices were stolen. Their silence was the loudest testimony of all. Even the most carefully constructed secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks. At Greenfield, the ladies' carefully cultivated world of control began to falter, not because of rebellion, but because cruelty leaves traces that cannot be hidden forever. Neighbors had always whispered about Margaret, the widow running a plantation on her own. They admired her success, but in the quiet corners of the market, at church gatherings, and along the dusty roads, rumors circulated. People spoke of her iron grip, of the overseers who feared her, and of the strange way her sons carried themselves, confident, demanding, and at times terrifyingly cruel. Some said it was natural for young men to assert authority. Others suspected something darker, though few dared speak openly. Inside the plantation, the brothers grew bolder. Thomas, the elder, no longer even attempted to mask his temper. He roamed the fields like a storm, snapping orders, striking with sudden violence, and taking what he wanted. Edward, quieter and colder, observed with calculating eyes, learning how to punish without leaving obvious marks, how to humiliate rather than bruise. Together, they had become almost unrecognizable, not boys taught by a mother, but masters in their own right, guided by a twisted code she had instilled in them. The enslaved whispered among themselves. Stories passed from one cabin to the next, warnings carried in hushed voices. Stay in your cabin after sundown. Keep your children close. Don't make a sound. The community had learned to hide their fear behind smiles, to answer questions in neutral tones, and to sing songs that carried hidden meanings only they could understand. But even in silence, tension grew like a low rumble, impossible to ignore. The cracks were not only social, but practical. A day's work missed here, a tool misplaced there. Small errors that might once have been overlooked now drew disproportionate punishment. The brothers' impatience with any imperfection created a climate of terror, and some of the enslaved began to make subtle plans to avoid detection. A misaligned row of cotton might mean hiding in the woods temporarily. A missed chore might mean pretending to be ill. Every day required vigilance, every action measured against the unpredictable fury of the sons. Even the children of the household noticed the tension. Guests visiting the mansion occasionally caught glimpses of the boys' sharp glances, their terse commands, their little smirks when someone faltered. They began to whisper to each other, a curiosity tinged with fear. What did it mean when a man laughed while punishing another? How could they reconcile the polite dinner manners with the cruelty in the fields? Neighbors, too, began to see changes. One morning, a local planter passing the edge of Greenfield swore he saw Thomas drag an enslaved man behind the stables, his hands tied, face bruised. Edward, walking nearby, looked on with a faint smile. The planter's horse shied in fright at the scene, and the passer-by never spoke of it publicly, but the memory lingered, spreading in muted whispers to those who dared listen. Margaret, aware of the attention, did what she always did, maintained the appearance of composure. She hosted church visitors, sat on the front porch in the afternoons, and ensured the mansion's lawns were immaculate. But even she could not fully control her sons. The boys' boldness began to spill over into recklessness. They no longer waited for her instructions, no longer concealed their actions. Power, once nurtured in secrecy, was now flaunted openly. The cracks in Greenfield were also moral. Among the enslaved, resentment simmered, and while outright rebellion was impossible, defiance took subtle forms. Crops were damaged, tools sabotaged, small acts of quiet resistance that would escape the brothers' notice unless they were watching. And yet every act, every whisper, every furtive glance carried with it the silent promise. History would remember. Even if the world around them did not, the tension in the household became a pressure cooker. The lady's careful facade began to strain under the weight of gossip, fear, and her son's audacity. The world beyond the plantation, increasingly restless, increasingly suspicious, started pressing against the walls she had built. Letters from distant relatives hinted at concerns. Neighbors' letters hinted at curiosity. Even the church, where she sat in the front pew with her composed face, could not completely ignore the murmurs circulating in the congregation. By the end of 1859, Greenfield was a place on the edge, a house built on wealth and terror, standing precariously against time and scrutiny. The seeds of destruction had been sown by the lady herself. The sons, taught to wield power without compassion, were now too strong to control. And the enslaved, suffering yet defiant in their quiet ways, carried knowledge that could one day expose the unthinkable truth. In many ways, the cracks were inevitable. No facade, however polished, could contain cruelty forever. No amount of discipline could hide the moral rot that had spread through the family. Greenfield's darkest secrets were beginning to surface, whispered in hushed tones, glimpsed in the corner of an eye, recorded in silent tears. The Lady of Greenfield could not yet see the full consequences. But those who lived under her roof, sons and enslaved alike, felt the tremors. The world outside, slowly shifting toward conflict and war, was about to bring everything to the surface. By late 1859, the South was no longer merely a land of sprawling plantations and quiet order. The air was thick with fear, fear of rebellion, fear of upheaval, and fear of the unknown future. The distant thunder of war was beginning to echo, and even Greenfield, hidden behind its white pillars and moss-draped oaks, could not escape it. Earlier that October, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry had sent shockwaves across the region. Though the raid had failed militarily, it ignited terror among slaveholders. Margaret and her sons could not ignore the news. Every headline, every whispered story in church pews and town squares, reminded them that the world beyond their plantation was shifting, that the very system they had relied upon for generations was under threat. For Margaret, the news was both a confirmation and a challenge. The world was dangerous, she told herself, and strength must be absolute. The lessons she had drilled into Thomas and Edward, lessons of control, dominance, and absolute authority, suddenly seemed not only practical but essential. The future of Greenfield, she believed, depended on their ability to wield power without hesitation. Thomas and Edward, now fully grown and accustomed to unquestioned authority, felt the tension differently. The boys, no longer boys at all, but young men hardened by cruelty and habit, saw the approaching unrest as both a threat and an opportunity. To them, the outside world could not touch the rules they had established within Greenfield. Here they were masters. Outside, uncertainty loomed, and they intended to hold their ground, no matter the cost. The enslaved, however, felt the tremors of change in a more profound way. News of John Brown's raid traveled by word of mouth, carried in secret conversations and work songs. For many, it was a spark of hope, a sign that the chains might someday break. But hope was dangerous, and in Margaret's household, danger could take a dozen forms. The enslaved learned to carry that hope quietly, hiding it behind smiles and feigned obedience, because a single misstep could result in punishment, far worse than labor. The plantation itself seemed to respond to the tension. Fields that had once been orderly now bore subtle signs of resistance. Crops were sabotaged, fences were loosened, tools were hidden. It was quiet, invisible work, but enough to unsettle the lady and her sons. They could feel the pulse of fear and resentment growing beneath their feet. The very people they believed completely under their control were not entirely silent. Neighbors, too, were shifting. Men in town, once concerned with simple trade and church appearances, began to speak in more serious tones about rebellion, about the fragility of slavery in a changing nation. Letters and rumors hinted at unrest, and Margaret, though outwardly composed, felt the walls of Greenfield tighten around her. Her sons, emboldened by their own cruelty but unnerved by the rumors, became more reckless in their displays of power. The more the world threatened them, the more violently they clung to control inside the plantation. By the end of 1859, the shadow of war was no longer distant. South Carolina, Georgia, and the surrounding states were bracing for conflict. Families across the South whispered about secession, about militias, about the possibility that enslaved people might rise. Margaret's careful world, once secure, was now pressed on all sides, by gossip, by fear, and by the slow march of history. And yet, within Greenfield, life carried on with a haunting normalcy. The lady hosted dinners, attended church, and maintained her polished exterior. Her sons patrolled the fields and enforced discipline with an unflinching hand. The enslaved women endured, hiding their pain behind smiles and quiet tears. But beneath it all, the shadow of war stretched closer each day. Pressing against the estate, like an invisible hand, it was a shadow that promised change. Change that Margaret could neither control nor fully understand. The system she had built, the cruel lessons she had taught her sons, and the silence she had demanded from the enslaved were all now poised against a world hurtling toward upheaval. And when the war finally arrived, nothing would remain the same. Greenfield's darkest secrets, long buried behind walls of wealth and authority, were on the brink of exposure. The lady, her sons, and the enslaved alike would be swept into the tide of history, a tide that would wash over the plantation, leaving scars that would last for generations. The winds of war finally reached the Carolina lowlands. By 1861, the nation had fractured, and Greenfield, like so many plantations, faced a storm that no wealth, no power, and no cruelty could withstand. The Civil War tore through the South, burning fields, upending towns, and sending families scrambling for survival. The lady's carefully maintained world, once so secure, began to crumble like dry leaves in a gust of wind. The brothers, Thomas and Edward, found that their authority, which had once seemed absolute, could not withstand the chaos of war. Some of their enslaved workers were called away to labor for the Confederate Army, while others seized opportunities to escape, slipping quietly into the night or finding refuge with Union forces. The fear that had kept Greenfield in line loosened its grip. Those who had endured silently for years now glimpsed freedom on the horizon. Margaret, once proud and unyielding, watched as her empire began to fall apart. Fields lay fallow, crops were lost to soldiers and raiders, and the ledgers she had guarded so jealously became meaningless scraps of paper. The wealth she had built on human suffering could not shield her from the broader collapse of a society under siege. She had raised her sons to command, to dominate, to control. Yet in the face of history's upheaval, they were powerless, just as she had always been in moments she did not foresee. The enslaved, once trapped beneath her iron hand, were finally free. Freedom did not erase the trauma, but it delivered a long-awaited justice. Some fled to the north, some stayed to rebuild lives on land they had once tilled in bondage, and others sought the children and family members torn from them by Greenfield's cruelty. The scars of the lady's tyranny, bruises, broken spirits, stolen childhoods, and unwanted children remained. But the chains had been broken, and with freedom came the ability to remember and bear witness. Greenfield itself did not survive intact. The mansion was eventually abandoned, its white pillars weathered by years of neglect, the fields overgrown and untended. Nature reclaimed the land, erasing the visible signs of wealth and authority, but it could not erase memory. The stories of cruelty, of stolen innocence, and of survival persisted. Oral histories carried by descendants, both of the enslaved and the lady's family, preserved the truth in whispers and songs. Margaret's legacy was complicated. To outsiders, she was simply a Southern widow, a figure in a long line of plantation matrons. To those who had suffered under her rule, she was something far darker, an architect of cruelty, a mother who twisted her own children into instruments of oppression. Thomas and Edward carried their mother's lessons forward, but even they could not escape the weight of their actions. Some descendants remembered them as men of power, others as men of cruelty, and still others faded into obscurity, leaving only shadows of their deeds. Yet even in this darkness, there were glimmers of resilience. The women who had endured Margaret's tyranny bore children who carried both the pain of the past and the hope of the future. Families were rebuilt, names reclaimed, and lives reconstructed piece by piece. The story of Greenfield, while horrific, became a testament to endurance, a reminder that even in the harshest oppression, the human spirit can survive and eventually reclaim its dignity. by the time Reconstruction swept through the South. Greenfield was no longer the seat of power it once had been. The mansion, the fields, and the records all stood as hollow monuments to cruelty. But the truth endured, carried not in ledgers or town gossip, but in the memories, songs, and stories of those who had survived. The lady's secrets, once buried behind walls and curtains, could no longer remain hidden. They were etched into history itself, a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and moral corruption can shape and ultimately destroy a family. Greenfield had fallen. The lady had lost her control. The sons had lost their authority. But the story remained, echoing through the generations as both a warning and a remembrance. And in that echo, the voices of the enslaved women, once silenced, once hidden, could finally be heard, bearing witness to the darkest chapter of a family and a nation struggling with its conscience. History is often told in grand events, battles won and lost, treaties signed, presidents elected. But the true story of America is also written in hidden rooms, whispered secrets, and the silent endurance of those who suffered in the shadows. Greenfield Plantation was one such story. A mother, outwardly refined and admired, had shaped her sons into instruments of cruelty, turning her family into a symbol of power misused. The enslaved women endured horrors that words can barely convey, their silence masking strength, resilience, and survival. And yet, for all the pain, life persisted. The children who survived, the families who rebuilt, and the voices passed down through generations became living testimony, proof that the human spirit cannot be fully broken. The lady's legacy, like so many hidden chapters of the Old South, faded from polite history books, replaced by tales of wealth and refinement. But the truth remains, etched into the lives she touched and the land she controlled. It is a reminder that behind every grand mansion, behind every polite smile, there may lie a story of cruelty, endurance, and survival. Greenfield is gone. The lady's power is gone. But the echoes of that family's darkest secret remain, a chilling testament to the past and a call to remember, to honor, and to never forget.